Hi, welcome to episode 77 of Yoga Research and Beyond. We're talking about a systematic review and meta-analysis that looks at the effects of mind-body interventions, mind-body activities on neuroendocrine functions. I'm your co-host, Ariana, founder of Yoga Research and Beyond and a yoga teacher, strength trainer here in New York and co-founder of New York Stretch.
Hi, I'm Jules Mitchell, and I teach yoga to yoga teachers. My work is mostly biomechanics and exercise science and a heavy dose of research literacy, which is why we're here.
Yeah, so this paper that we're talking about is very, when I was looking at it, I was kind of very saturated with a lot of data, which is great, but we're not going to dive deep into all of that data. We're going to give you an overview of it. The title of this paper is Effects of Mind-Body Interventions on Immune and Neuroendocrine Functions, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. It's by Xiqing Li and three colleagues in the Memorial Hospital in Taiwan, where it was done. It was published in Healthcare Journal in April 2025. Neuroendocrine functions, simply, it refers to how the nervous system regulates processes in the body, like stress responses, mood, metabolism, sleep, immune function, reproduction. And in the context of this paper for mind-body exercises, like yoga, meditation, how those activities can improve neuroendocrine function could mean like just helping with overactive stress responses, lowering cortisol is how they would look at that, and enhancing brain health and emotional regulation. The purpose of the paper is to assess whether these mind-body interventions like yoga, Qigong, Tai Chi, and other mindfulness-based practices have measurable effects on these markers of the neuroendocrine system. So those markers, as I said, cortisol is one of those things that they look at, and something called BDNF in the brain, which I'm forgetting what it stands for, but it is involved in emotional regulation. And this is a systematic review, which, Jules, you want to talk a little bit about what that means?
We'll jump in. So there's several things that caught my attention on this paper. One of them being that it's a systematic review and a meta-analysis, which I don't think we've done yet on this podcast. So it's a good opportunity to teach people what that is. So as it says in the title, that it is a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And we've done randomized controlled trials where there's obviously, two subject pools and one gets an intervention and one gets a comparator of some sort. And this is a review of those. So a systematic review means that they will look at all the randomized controlled trials that are published on a certain topic. And in this case, it would be anything from yoga, meditation, Tai Chi on some sort of biomarker that is measurable, that is related to neuroimmune endocrine function. So that's actually a really broad category. So that's what the systematic review part is that they look at all the randomized controlled trials. And then the meta-analysis part is where they actually run statistical analyses on those reviews. So it's kind of like this gold standard. It's like if you're looking at a hierarchy of the quality of research, randomized control trials are, like baseline of the gold standard. And then when you take all of those and compile them and run statistics on top of those, you will get even more accurate results. And part of that is because of the methods of how it's done, which I don't want to get into just yet. I'll pass it off to Ariana before that. But just so you understand what a systematic review is, it's like a compilation review of the randomized control trials. And just real quick before I pass it back to you, the one thing that I really liked about the paper was like right in the introduction, like right in the second paragraph. And it was talking about how the first sentence says the immune, nervous, and endocrine systems are interconnected. And I think that's like one of the most valuable things that we can learn as yoga teachers from reading this paper, if you don't know that already. If you've been studying pain science, it's one of the things we do in my 300 hour. I have a lot of researchers around pain science come in. And that's like one of the big revelations that we are now learning and understanding is that the immune function and endocrine function are heavily regulated by the nervous system. And so I've heard the neuroimmune system, like as a single system. And when we're studying in the textbooks, we take apart all of the systems. So we learn what the nervous system does and what the immune system does. But now we're really realizing that some nerve cells are actually immune cells. And so they have this dual function, and the same as with the endocrine system. And so that's what makes this study so powerful, is that they're really looking at some of these mind-body practices, which we always have casually referred to them as stress relievers and good for health and wellness. But this is actually looking at the actual mechanism, right? It's actually measuring biomarkers in the blood that are, like Ariana said, stress hormones like cortisol that you've all heard of because it's in the news all the time, various interleukins, various things that we can measure. And so we're trying to see like, what is the mechanism by which yoga makes you healthier? So that's what made me excited about this paper.
Yeah, that is cool. And I am hearing that terminology used more and more. So it's nice to have that kind of parsed out to explain that more.
Mm-hmm. And just real quick before you go on, like if that's all you get from as a yoga teacher reading this paper, that's amazing. Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, exactly. So you don't have to say, well, yoga reduces, whichever interleukin by 0.3%. No, you don't need to know any of that. Just understand that this is like validated by researchers looking at, hey, this is the mechanism by how we think this works, which is cool.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, we're not going to go into those kind of specifics in this anyway. So the way that they did this, they searched for articles in three databases. And again, as Jules said, they're looking only at RCTs, the gold standard in this research. And the papers that they were looking at were published between 2000 and 2024, so quite a long time span. And in the end, they included 89 RCTs that measured the biomarkers, a bunch of biomarkers. And I always love this process, looking at this process of what they end up with for the final analysis and what they start with. So initially, when they did the first search, they had over 1,600 papers that they found. Then they have search criteria that they decide that they want to use for the final analysis. And it always ends up being much less than what they originally searched, what they originally find.
Always.
And I just think that's so interesting.
So I'll jump in for a second there. So on page 10 of this paper, there's the flow chart. So if you are new to reading systematic reviews and you want to get better at it, that's one of the first things you look for. You look for like the flow chart. This one is done by the PICO, which is Population Intervention Comparator Outcome. And that's what they use to define the eligibility criteria. And you can actually like go online and like look at different types of flowcharts and such. But basically what happens is exactly what Ariana said. They search the databases. They get, in this case, they got 1,697 papers that fit those criteria. But then they had to start going through it to see if they really are eligible. Just because everyone's Googled and you've Googled a search term and what you got was not what you were looking for. And so that has to happen. So if let's just say they Google the term yoga, but then when they look at the paper, there was actually no yoga intervention, the word was just in the introduction or something, then that wouldn't qualify, obviously, So that's what they had to do. And what's really interesting with systematic reviews is kind of like, who's the determining person? And so they mentioned in this paper, there were 2 investigators that were looking at independently. They have to look at each paper on their own, so they don't try and sway each other. And they're like, okay, this one's good. We'll use this one. This one's not good. This one's good. This one's not good. And then they have a third party that is the one that comes and makes the decision if they disagree. So they don't have to try to convince each other. And that's really how it's usually done. And it should be listed in the systematic review how that is done. So it's not one person bullying the other to change their mind if they disagree. So that's what they did. And what they really looked for when they were determining the eligibility is they looked at, like I said, the PICO, so population. So were the participants like, did they fit within the age and sex and things that they were looking for? I mean, if they were looking at young children and that was not part of the systematic review, the population would exclude that paper. They were looking at the interventions. So in this case, they needed studies that involved mind-body interventions. And that could have been a variety of things, like we've said. And it could be any session in any duration. So sometimes you want to qualify. We want at least studies where the intervention was 6 weeks or something, and then that would exclude it. But they didn't have that here. The comparator, as I mentioned before, so there needed to be some form of control or other intervention to compare it against. If they didn't have that, it was excluded. And then the outcome. So they needed for it to be included in the systematic review. The outcome needed measurement of biomarker levels, which we talked about, as well as certain statistical parameters. They needed to report mean, standard deviation, and effect size. And if you've been listening to the podcast, a lot of papers don't report effect size. They report p-value. And so if they couldn't extract, because you can extract effect size from mean and standard deviation, if they couldn't do that, the paper was excluded. And that's the process by how you get from 1,697 papers to 89. And I will tell you, just from reading a lot of systematic reviews, that 89 is actually a high number. I've seen you get, 3,000 papers down to 12 that are included. Yeah. Yes. So, and the one other thing before I pass it off to you that I didn't mention is one of the other things that they do is they have to remove duplicates, because that's another thing you have to pay attention to. You're a researcher, you get this really expensive long-term data set, and so you want to get it published in as many papers as possible. And so you use that data set to submit to different journals, and each journal has different criteria for how long it should be and how it should be written. And so sometimes it doesn't look like the same paper until you look at the data set and realize it's a different paper, but it's the same data set. So they had to exclude those. So they remove a lot of duplicates, because that's very common. And then one of the things they mentioned in here is if it was a duplicate, they held on to the paper. They excluded it from the systematic review, but they held on to the paper in case they needed to access some data for what they needed for this, or they could sometimes email the authors. Because again, some journals will say, we don't want effect size. We just want p-value. So they had access to larger pools of data from holding on to the papers, but not including them as separate papers. That was long-winded, but clear, no, I think.
But it's such good information that attests to the high quality of this paper.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah. I would agree.
Okay, so once they gathered all of that, they used specific statistical methods to analyze the data for the meta-analysis part. Not going into that. Mm-hmm. Just a brief outline of some things that they found: that the interventions decreased some inflammatory markers, like the cortisol and some cytokines, and I forget what the
interleukins.
Interleukins. Yeah. And it also increased immune enhancing markers, which I thought was interesting. And we're not going into how much and which ones of that, but
I'll just mention that quickly, that so cytokines can come in a pro-inflammatory and an anti-inflammatory form, right? And so that's exactly what you're getting at, is that it could reduce the pro-inflammatory and then increase the anti-inflammatory versions of those cells, which is kind of cool.
Very cool. And then they had some subgroup findings that they found some increases in the BDNF for emotional and brain regulation, for neuroprotective effects. And they also looked at cancer patients, how exercise can potentially induce immune activation. And they also looked at inflammatory diseases, viral infections. So a wide range of diseases and conditions that they're looking at there.
Did you catch that? This is what I interpret it to be. So I want to see if you kind of agreed with me, but that cancer was kind of the one, they had generally positive results, obviously not by extremes. Please don't listen to this podcast and go out and say that, doing yoga prevents disease. It's more complicated than that, but there were some positive changes in the biomarkers, but cancer seemed to be the one that was most resistant It was, so I have in my notes, cancer seems to be especially resistant to mind-body interventions. That was kind of what I got near the end in the discussion. Like they weren't seeing the same type of results.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought that was part of the, just like the process of the tumor that was just like, once that's taken over, it's going to be really hard to reverse with some of these interventions.
Yeah, I did catch that also. Yeah.
It was kind of dismal, kind of bummed me out.
Yeah. I mean, not that it just wasn't the same extent as some of the other things, like still helpful, but just not in the same way. More resistant.
But it just makes me like, like this is why we all hate cancer so much. That's like what it made me. Again, don't leave here saying yoga doesn't help people with cancer. Don't say that either, but it's just, this is the bummer.
Yeah. So the effects were, even though they see effects across the studies, they were pretty much all small effects, minimal to moderate across all the biomarkers. And so basically it emphasizes what we're saying here, how we need to be careful how far we take these kinds of findings and studies and what that means in terms of what we bring to our clients and to our classes and stuff.
Well, that's one thing I want to add. They did say, like in there, they said future research should focus on longitudinal studies, which are the long-term studies, right, to determine whether these changes in biomarkers lead to meaningful clinical outcomes. That's the last sentence of the discussion. And I want to highlight, just if you've been listening to our podcast for a while, I've talked about it before, internal versus external validity. And this is a great example. So having the reduction of these biomarkers is an internally valid result for this study. What they're saying in that last sentence is saying what we need now is long-term studies to see if it prevents death or it prevents disease, because that would be external validity. And you can't determine that from this study. So that's the difference between internal and external validity. If somebody does yoga for 20 years, are they less likely to get cancer? Are they less likely to get a chronic disease? And this is just measuring the biomarker. And I think that's the mistake people make when seeing this research on social media. They think, oh, hey, Tai Chi reduced cortisol, and therefore the conclusion is that everybody needs to be doing Tai Chi and they'll live longer if they do, And it's like, that's the difference between internal and external validity.
Yeah. And again, it's not saying don't do it, because there are benefits.
Yep.
It's just, not a cure-all. So limitations are basically what you were just saying. That's what I have noted here for the limitations in terms of clinical application.
Yeah.
There was something
about short-term studies. They wanted to know, one of the questions they asked was, these are the short-term results of these interventions, because they're just like doing the intervention and then measuring, doing the biomarkers. But what are the long-term? How long do the effects last? If you do yoga for a year and then stop, and like, those are all things that can't be answered by the nature of these studies.
Yeah, but I think you're right. The most important thing about this paper for us teachers is what you highlighted in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to bring to this paper.
I don't think so either. Yeah, short-term, long effects. Yep, those are all my notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was a very well done paper, low risk of bias. They did all the proper things. And I'll just add one thing just to end with. I put a paper clip through maybe more than half of this study, paper clipped them together. Because one of the things that happens in a systematic review, and why I think people feel like they're so daunting, is because there's so many tables and charts. And since there were 89 papers, they have a table listing every single paper. And so you as a reader don't have to read all that, but the good news is when you are reading and they're talking about a single study, maybe let's just say it's one specifically on yoga and cancer, then you can go to the table, see the original paper, and then go read what that paper did. Again, some of these were on Tai Chi, some were on meditation, and they don't get into the weeds in that systematic review, or the paper would be, entire volume length. So they have to condense it. So just realize that the bulk of a systematic review is often just reporting on the papers, and that you're not going to be stuck reading a 45-page paper. You're going to be reading a 20-page paper, and 15 pages of that is just tables and charts.
Yeah, it skimmed right through that. But you're right that it's useful if you're interested in something in particular and you find it in that table and you can use it as a jumping point to read that
Absolutely.
paper.
And they need to be there just by the nature of a systematic review, because you do need to be able to go back and look. I mean, I remember doing a systematic review analysis with someone who was in my mentoring program for a while. And we like, it was about like glute activation and certain exercises. And there was just like a table. But she wanted to know what they did in this study to get that result from that table. And so we had to go through and we did look at all the tables. So I'm like, that's what I mean. The information in them is necessary and valuable. But when you're reading the paper, you don't need to read all those things until you need to reference them. Then you can go back and find them.
Yeah. Super useful.
That's it.
All right. Thank you, Jules. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Please, if you like this podcast, remember to subscribe and share it with your fellow yoga teachers who might find it interesting. And let's keep the conversation going about how we can use research to inform and inspire how we teach. See you next time.